Hey everyone, hello from Nice here in France. I wanted to make a quick response to another excellent William Spaniel video in the spirit of, hey, here's a guy brilliantly contending with a complex geopolitical issue and there's no way to say everything you want to say, even in a long form video like what he's able to produce on a regular basis at a high level. But he did mention something in particular around the Ukrainian spring offensive in his most recent video, and I wanted to touch on it briefly because it actually dovetailed quite nicely with one of my earlier videos. And that was a video where I talked about really how the war might end in Ukraine, the Russian war of aggression in Ukraine. And it was interesting because part of what William got into was that one of the things that's changed and made things more difficult for the Ukrainian armed forces is Russia's so-called digital draft, the way that they've continued conscription, and obviously their forces are going to become larger and larger as they need to draw on more folks from within the Russian Federation. Obviously the way that they're recruiting those individuals is not done evenly across the board, as we've read in many news outlets. This forced recruitment tends to take place, as it often does in countries including the United States. It tends to take place in communities underprivileged, underserved communities, ethnic minority communities, things of that nature. But one of the points I think that gets lost in this sort of conscription debate, and it's something, and I'll link the video I made previously above for context. There's obviously the human element of this, and there's sort of a long-standing leftist perspective that forced recruitment and drafting is a war crime. It should be illegal. It's not something that we need to be doing in the 21st century. And there's interesting points to kind of contend with there. And I think it's also an issue where you see, as development and democratization increase in a country, the likelihood of having a draft goes down for a variety of reasons, both representational and I think economic, right? There's lots of reasons that happens. And one of the really interesting reasons that it happens, in my opinion, and I talked about this previously with the example of the Estado Novo sort of authoritarian regime in Portugal at the end of the colonial period. Another great example would be the 1986 Egyptian mutinies around forced recruitment, where there was a massive kind of military mutiny as conscription, basically the terms of conscription were kind of changed underneath people, right? And they sort of realized, hey, I'm gonna have to stay in the armed forces here in Egypt for longer than I thought I would, for no real gain for myself. So there's various reasons, there's various examples of this, but really the point is, on the one hand, there's the humanitarian element, right, of we really shouldn't be doing this. This is kind of horrifying for people to experience, especially in the context of living in a non-representative country, right? It's one thing to be forced to serve in the Taiwanese or South Korean or even Israeli military, and it's another thing to be forced to do that in a regime and in a political context where you have, no one in the country has the ability to have a say in representative government. So that's the one side of it. The other side of it is from a sort of structural military and strategic perspective. Doing this thing, right, doing this forced conscription has, and we've seen this many times, especially in non-representative countries and polities, there is an outcome there where it will lead to the degradation of morale within the armed forces, and it's more likely to produce a situation, to produce an outcome where the military is increasingly unreliable, right? Because, as I mentioned with the Estado Novo regime, this was a regime that was desperately trying to hold on to, colonial, areas that they had dominated through the process of colonialism and sort of politically captured, right, to the process of colonialism. And this was a regime that was very unpopular, obviously, in those places, but also quite unpopular in Portugal because they weren't a particularly nice bunch of human beings. And what happened in that circumstance was essentially what we're seeing here in Russia, right? There was massive immigration or out-migration for the young men in particular who could do that, who had the means to get away. There was a huge brain drain and a huge cost to Portugal from that perspective. And then for the folks who didn't have the means to do that, they were recruited into the military, and increasingly there was a large enough group of people within the armed forces that didn't want to be there and didn't believe in these colonial wars, that eventually the result of this was a coup, a mutiny, and the collapse of the Estado Novo regime. And obviously, I don't want to downplay the efforts that the freedom fighters and anti-colonial folks in East and West Africa, in Southeast Asia, there were a lot of, in India, there were lots of areas in which folks were fighting the Estado Novo regime. But ultimately, what really crushed their ability to project power and continue as a political organization was, they're an authoritarian regime that's heavily militarized, both ideologically and sort of structurally dependent on this idea of being the ones who can project force. And they, through the process of forced conscription, lost the ability to do that because the people that they were conscripting did not want to be there, and they didn't want to participate in this, right? So I think this is all to say, I really, again, love William Spaniel's work. I love his most recent video, gave me a lot to think about. But one thing I'd push back on gently, I think, and sort of collaboratively, is there is a price to be paid, right? You can't just, and not to say that he's saying this, but it's not StarCraft or something, right? It's not like an overhead strategy game where you can just up your production of troops. Now, I need to recruit more troops from this or that oblast, right? It doesn't really work that way, because as you're doing that, you are creating this sort of long-term effect of, there's an economic cost, there's a humanitarian cost, quite obviously, but there's also potentially this cost, this catastrophic cost to the regime and to the armed forces themselves, because you could build up to a point where there's a critical mass of people in the armed forces who do not want to be there, and who will organize and consolidate around taking action to prevent that from happening. And Russia is actually, a political community, a polity where there's, hundreds of years of these kinds of mutinies of people who are forced into a certain situation. And then as that critical mass of discontents grows, eventually there's a point where it snaps, and you end up with a battleship, mutiny or something like that, right? So that's all I wanted to talk about today, and I really, again, hope that it adds to what William was saying, and I think in general making great points on that front. But as always, I really appreciate you watching, and always looking forward to your comments in the comment section below. Thanks again. Have a good one.